Hello, welcome to the basics of immigration, refugee, and asylum. Today, I am going to talk about some of the very basic concepts of refugees and asylees, or refugee status and asylum. These are complex topics with lots of nuances, lots of legal things. I'm not going to get into all of that. As always, my purpose is to provide some basic concepts that help you understand the laws and processes involved in the United States law so that you can then analyze and understand other things that you hear about. These are hot topics. We hear about them a lot. I want you to be able to understand what really happens with refugee and asylum status, or at least what the law and the processes are. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about refugees, how someone becomes a refugee. And I say how someone becomes a refugee. You can become a refugee, however. What I mean to say is how you come into the United States and gain refugee status. To start with, let's draw a United States. As always, this represents U.S. territory. It's not intended to be a map. All right, first thing about a refugee is this is someone outside of the United States. They aren't over there. They are outside of the country. Something happens and they now fear for their life in the country where they are living. Probably their home country, but could be somewhere else where they have relocated and migrated to. They are afraid for their life. They want to come to a safe place. Could be the United States, could be somewhere else. Here's basically what happens at this point. Someone is scared to stay in their own country. They believe that they will be harmed, killed if they stay in their own country. In some cases, they just go find a safe place to live. Maybe they go live with a friend, or they go into hiding in their own country. In many cases, they go to camps. There are camps that the Red Cross and other humanitarian groups set up where refugees can come when there is large spread conflict in a region. They may go live there. Some people live there for years and even decades. Many people are born in those camps. They don't really even have a home anywhere. At some point, they need to register with an entity that the United Nations runs that organizes refugees. They register with that group, and then when it's their turn, they get to go have a refugee interview. Now, here's an interesting part here. This group that the UN runs is for countries all over the world who are accepting refugees. It's not just the United States. It's the United Nations here, not a US entity. And so when it's your turn for an interview, you could potentially get selected to go interview with whichever country is interviewing. Maybe that's Germany. Maybe that's Canada. Maybe it's Australia. Maybe it's the United States. They don't necessarily get to choose which country they want to interview with. They get an interview and they go to that interview, and an officer from one of the countries, whichever country is doing their interview, determines if they meet a refugee definition. We'll talk about that later, how you meet that definition. They decide if they meet the refugee definition. They also screen them for potential national security or other issues. And then at that point, if it is determined that they are a refugee and that they can come into the country that's interviewing them, then they get refugee status. And at that point, they come to the United States. Like always, they would come to the port of entry, and assuming everything is good, they would be admitted to the United States as a refugee. So here they are now in the United States as a refugee. At that point, they then are eligible to apply for LPR status, lawful permanent residency status, and eventually someday they can become a United States citizen. Same process that we've talked about in other things. But their actual entry would be a little bit different here. They don't have a visa. They would come in as a refugee. So again, process is they register, they get an interview with a country. If everything is okay with them, then they get to come to the port of entry and be admitted as a refugee. Okay, so that's how refugee status works. Different countries have some different requirements. The definition of refugee is an international definition, but then other requirements could vary based on the country to come in. But for the United States purposes, if they're a refugee and they check out with their screening, then they are able to come into the United States. Okay, that's a refugee. Now let's talk about asylum and what asylum is. The person, of course, is an asylee, but we'll talk about asylum. This person is in the United States. They might be all the way in the United States. They might be over here at a port of entry. But they are actually in U.S. territory. So that's one big difference. As we talked about, this person starts outside of the country. This person is in U.S. territory. Even that's just one step onto land. They are in the United States when they ask for asylum. They apply for asylum. There are actually a couple of different ways that this could work, so I'll go through both of them. They can affirmatively apply for asylum, maybe at the port of entry, maybe when they're in the United States, but at some point they say, I need asylum, and they ask for asylum. They apply for it. A government agency called USCIS then looks at them to say, do you meet the definition of a refugee? It's the same definition as the refugees, which we haven't gotten to, we'll get to in a minute, but they look to see if they meet that definition. If they do meet the definition, then they get asylum. If they don't meet the definition, then they're put into removal proceedings, which you can watch about in another segment. They get another chance here. If they're put into removal proceedings, the immigration judge will again look to see if they meet the definition for asylum. There's a second route. The second route is that they are put into removal proceedings before they've ever asked for asylum. Maybe at the port of entry, maybe in the country, they're put into removal proceedings. If at that point they say, please don't send me home, I need asylum, then the IJ, the immigration judge, would look to see if they meet the definition of a refugee. Okay? So again, two different processes for asylum. The last thing I want to talk about for today is what is the definition of a refugee that both of these people have to meet. The definition of a refugee. Again, this could get I could make this complicated if we got into all the fine points. We're not going to. This is actually a constantly evolving area of law, but I'm going to explain the basic concepts right here. The basic idea is somebody has been persecuted, is being persecuted, or has a really good reason to fear future persecution for one of these things: their race, their religion, their national origin, their political beliefs, or a particular social group. Most of these are pretty obvious: race, religion, national origin, and political beliefs. They can get nuanced, but in general, they are more clear. Now, particular social group, this is the area that's a little less clear, and therefore it's the area that gets lots of attention, lots of pushing the boundaries, finding where the boundaries are. The general idea is that you belong to some kind of group that would be persecuted. Like maybe you belong to the police, and the army in your country is persecuting former police or current police, or maybe you're a professor at a university and the government is persecuting professors. You can look at a lot of different countries and think of a lot of different things where people would be persecuted. I won't go into all of them. You can read online, you can talk to anyone who has refugee status, and you can learn more about that. But that's the idea of what particular social group means. And I should say, this persecution is either by the government or it's by a group that the government cannot control. Just because someone's persecuting you for your religion, if the government is going to stop that in your own country, then you would not be eligible for asylum or refugee status. You have to show that your country can't protect you. Therefore, you need to be able to go somewhere else where you can be protected. That's the basic idea of refugee status. One thing to keep in mind, refugees out of the country, asylum in the country. And like I said, they could have been in the country for 2 seconds. They could land and get off a plane and say, I want to claim asylum. But they do need to be in the United States. Both of them have to meet the definition of a refugee. They can apply for it affirmatively, or in the case of asylum, if they're put into removal proceedings, they can apply for it at that point. This is the definition of a refugee. The basic concept is you're being persecuted because of something that is core to who you are, and the government is either doing the persecution or can't stop the persecution. Therefore, you need to go to another country. One thing I'll just mention briefly, because it keeps coming to my mind, with asylum, some people are coming to the United States to get asylum. That's why they left and they came in the first place. Other people are here in the United States when something happens at home that makes it so they want to stay here. Their country may erupt in civil war, or they're connected to a government that gets overturned, or other such things. So they may already be in the United States when something at home makes it that it's not safe for them to go home anymore. Or they could be coming here in the first place because it's not safe. So that's the basic idea. I hope that helps understand refugee and asylum status. And feel free to ask questions and stay tuned for additional information about how this affects our world today. One question that already came up as I was erasing the whiteboard is, what about asylees? Can they also become citizens? And the answer is yes. Just like with the refugee process, once they are admitted, they then have the opportunity to adjust their status to become an LPR, a lawful permanent resident. And like other lawful permanent residents, after a certain amount of time, they then can apply for naturalization following that same process. So whether someone comes as a refugee or is granted asylum, they then begin a path that could potentially lead to lawful permanent residency and then to citizenship. Not a guarantee, but it is possible for them. Also, both of those groups of people can bring family members, immediate family members, so spouses and minor children. And I actually don't know about parents. I'll add that in later. But they can bring their family with them. Potentially, their family could also qualify for asylum or refugee status based on the same factors. But if not, they could come as family members. All right, hope that's helpful. Talk to you later.